Breaker Alpha Foxtrot, this is the Wizard. Do you read me, Sitting Duck?
This is Peking Duck. I hear you, Blizzard.
Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. Today we are diving into the Sly Cooper franchise, if you couldn't have guessed by the intro, and I'm really excited about this one. You know, this is a franchise that really got me into wanting to be a 3D modeler and a game designer, and I'm really stoked to show you guys how to make the Sly Cooper Cane. Hopefully that's in focus, but yeah, we're going to be making the Sly Cooper Cane today. So let's hop on over and I'm going to show you guys all the requirements it takes to build this cane out, and we'll go from there. So this is everything you're going to need to complete this build, and I've attached all of the links to these items down in the description. Okay, so before we get into actually making this, I want to go through the file and kind of show you guys what you're getting when you download it. So I have about 7 pieces right now if you include the whole top of the cane, 6 if it's only just the broken up parts. So I have the pummel that goes down here at the bottom where you can just slide in the wooden dowel. It's a pretty tight fit. If it ends up being too tight, you can end up hitting it with a heat gun, or you can just sand the inside of it, which is typically what I do. Maybe sand a little bit of the dowel if it's a little rough. Sometimes the grain on the wood makes it a little tough to slide in, and you can really fix that by just sanding it down just a tad bit. Then we move up to the top where the cane is. We have this little mechanism right here. Same thing as the bottom pummel. It can slide in, and if you have trouble sliding it in, sand both pieces and it should be fine. And then likewise, the top of the cane can slide right into here. And then I've sliced it right here because that's where I figured would be the best spot to make it pretty seamless. And then we have the little dowel that you can fit in here. You can also use a wooden dowel if you want to. I always print these out of resin and it works fine every time. So do with that what you will. And then I finally added just the cane as a whole if you want to practice slicing yourself, or if you think there's a better method than the way that I'm doing it. So now that I've shown you guys how I've broken this up, let's take this over to the printer and get started with it. So I'm printing the Sly Cane on an Elegoo Saturn II resin printer, but if all you have is an FDM printer, that's okay too. Everything should work fine on an FDM just like it does a resin printer. You'll just have to sand down those layer lines if you want the same outcome as the resin printer. So we're at about 95% with printing the top of the cane, and it's looking great so far. We have a little line right there as you can see, but it should sand out pretty quickly once we get to that step. So from start to finish, it took about 19 hours and 10 minutes to complete, and it looks great. Now we need to get it off of the build plate and clean it and prep it to be painted. So what I'm doing now is I'm putting the print in this little jacuzzi, which basically just clears out all the existing resin that is trapped inside of the print. And this step is really important because over time it can really degrade the infill that's inside of this resin print. And now that all the resin is cleared out, we are going to cure this print with the UV light. Now, you can go outside and leave this in the sun. Just be careful with how long you leave it out there for. I typically don't like to leave them out there for more than 5 minutes, but that's why I like to use the UV lamps because it's a little bit more controlled. And if you're interested in grabbing these, you can totally snag these off the links I have down below. Now that everything's cured, we're going to break this down with some 220 grit sandpaper and work our way up all the way to 400 grit sandpaper to get that nice polished finish. And a little sanding tip I have is really make sure that you're going with the flow of the lines. You can really dull these lines and almost make them non-existent if you're pressing too hard or sanding over them really vigorously.
Show your bling and let me shine you. Smooth. Look, see the money. You'll like the money. The money.
on the mic with a shout out to all my nightclub samurai. Smooth. Keep it smooth, baby. Walk tall.
So now that everything's sanded down, we're going to use 5-minute Gorilla Glue epoxy. And when you're using this, really stir this thoroughly so the two components really mesh well together. And we're just going to spread it along the piece, trying not to get a lot of excess off. If you do, it's okay. You can just wipe it down like you see me doing here. And then we're going to move pretty quickly into using the UV craft resin to make that seam disappear on where we sliced it. And with this resin, make sure you're not globbing it on there. Just layer it up a little bit at a time. And that's why I like the sponge brushes, is because you can kind of dab it and move it around and build it up slowly as you go along. I also want to add a little safety tip here, that when you're working with the resin or the 2-in-1 epoxy, make sure that you're wearing gloves. You don't want this stuff getting on your hands. It's highly toxic and the skin absorbs stuff at a rate that's ridiculous. If you do end up getting it on your skin somewhere or your hands, make sure to go wash it with soap and water really thoroughly and take your time with it. So while we have the craft resin out, we're also going to fill these little resin drain holes. And there's a little hack that I like to use, is putting a little bit of paper towel or toilet paper inside of the hole, and it allows the resin to kind of be absorbed into the paper towel. It just makes it easier to kind of fill the holes faster and use less resin in the process. So now that all the resin's applied, we're going to take some 220 grit sandpaper and sand it all back down and try to make it look as smooth and seamless as possible in the areas that we added the resin. Sometimes when you're sanding too, you're going to have to go back in and add a little bit more resin in certain areas. Sometimes when you're sanding, some of the resin will pull up or leave little divots or scratches. It's perfectly fine to do this process quite a few times if you need to get it completely smooth the way you like it. So with this step, what I'm doing is hitting it with a 2-in-1 sandable filler primer, and what it does is basically, in the name of the can, it's going to fill in all of these little spots and prime it to be painted. Usually I'll repeat this step about 2 to 3 times if I need to go back through and sand it just to get the level of smoothness that I want. So we need to give the head of the cane a little bit of time to dry. So move on to the pommel and the base of where the head of the cane goes. And we're going to sand this with some 220 grit sandpaper to start off.
Show your bling and let me shine you. We smooth. Look, see the money. You like the money, the money, the money.
So there seems to be a little line left where I extruded the piece inside for the dowel to fit. So in order to speed up the process a little bit, I'm going to hit it with an orbital sander. You can also use a mouse sander, or you can just do it by hand. If you do the hand method, it's just going to take a little bit longer, and that's why I just wanted to speed up the process just a little bit by orbital sanding it.
the mic with a shout out to all my nightclub samurai.
Smooth. Keep it smooth, baby.
And just like before, we're going to hit it with some 2-in-1 sandable film and let it sit and dry.
Juice. Who's got the juice? Smooth. Dig the kinetic.
So now that this part of the cane is dry, we are going to hit it with some 320 grit sandpaper to really smooth it out and give it that nice polished look.
Greasy sweet. Got to keep it smooth. Here I come again. Got to keep it smooth. Greasy sweet. Freak out.
So now that we have everything all smoothed out with the 320 grit, we're going to hit this with Rust-Oleum Gloss Marigold, and this is the closest yellow that I found that matches the cane inside of the game. And while you're doing this, make sure to just kind of lightly spritz the piece. We're just trying to get a good bond between the piece and the paint so we can go back through with the 400 grit sandpaper and really finally smooth it to how we want it. And while we're waiting for the head of the cane to dry, we're just going to repeat the process with the end pommel piece and the base of the head.
We smooth. Look, see the money.
You like the money.
So now that the piece is dry, we're going to move on to the last little bit of sanding that we have. We're going to hit this with some 400 grit sandpaper, and you might have to repeat this process a couple times till you get your preferred smoothness, but I don't think you have to go any higher unless you really want to in sandpaper grit. And then we're going to take it back into the spray booth to hit it with some Gloss Marigold again. Now, this is definitely going to be a heavier spray this time around, but you don't want to go too heavy because you don't want the paint drip marks. So be conscious of it, take your time, and it's okay if you have to hit it a few times for each side.
Who's got the juice? Smooth. Dig the kinetic. Kinetic is static. Yeah.
And now we're going to repeat this same process as we did for the head of the cane. We're just going to hit this with some 400 grit sandpaper to really get these pieces nice and smooth.
Here I come again. Got to keep it smooth. Greasy sweet. Freak out. Let's dance. Got to keep it smooth. Greasy sweet. Let's dance. Got to keep it.
For the wooden dowel, I'm using 1 1/4 inch diameter by 34 inches. Now, typically these come in about 36 inches in length, so you're gonna have to cut it just a little bit. And I'm using a miter saw, but you guys can use whatever type of saw gets the job done. This is just what's easiest for me. So I'm using a wooden dowel from a previous project, but your wooden dowel is going to look more like this lighter one here. So we're going to have to end up staining it. And the stain that I use is Mini Wax Wood Finish, and it is a dark walnut color 2716. You also have the option to paint this wooden dowel, but me personally, I like seeing the wood grain and the texture in it, so that's more achievable with the stain than painting it. But if you're going with the stain option, all the instructions are on the back. It's pretty easy to follow. You just don't want to oversaturate the piece with stain. You want to do it lighter and with layers, like a lot of stuff. With the painting, with the resin, you always want to layer stuff on, just not glob it on there all willy-nilly. And you also want to do kind of longer strokes from the top to the bottom to really get that nice finish, and you're not going to have brush strokes in the piece. Also, just like when handling the resin, make sure you're wearing gloves for this. You don't want to get this stain and all these toxic chemicals on your hand. And one other thing before you start staining the wood, make sure you have a place to put this. I'm putting it in a vice grip that's a little bit off of the screen. You can kind of see it in the bottom right corner, but I'm putting it in a vice grip to let it dry. Usually you have to let it dry for about 10 or 15 minutes, swipe it down, and then reapply the piece again until you get the darkness and the richness that you want out of the stain. What you don't want to be doing is scrambling to try to find a place to put this once you've actually stained it. Now that this has had some time to dry, we're going to wipe this piece down with a paper towel, and again, if you want it to be a little bit darker, reapply and wait another 10 minutes, wait another 5 minutes depending on what you want, and wipe it down again, and you can just repeat the process until you get the level of like darkness and richness that you want in the piece. So after about a day and a half of letting the piece dry, I'm going to hit this with some satin clear enamel, and this really just pulls the piece together. It really makes the paint pop. You can also seal the handle itself. I didn't end up doing it just because I wanted it to be kind of weathered and have the elements hit it and stuff like that. It gives it more of a realistic effect to it. But if you do end up sealing it, maybe sealing it with a matte sealer. Satin probably would be fine too. But if you do, let me know down in the comments below. I'd love to hear your experience with it. So now we're moving on to the final step, which is using the 5-minute Gorilla Glue epoxy to glue the pommel and the head to the wooden dowel. And again, make sure you're stirring this stuff really well to get a nice combination of the two mixtures. And I like to do it where I do a little bit of the rim inside of the tip of the cane, and then I also put a little bit on top of the wooden dowel. And if you end up getting some of the epoxy on the piece anywhere, it's okay. It's fixable, salvageable. Just make sure to grab some paper towel or have some on hand and wipe it off as quick as you notice it, because the longer you wait, the harder it is to clean off. So even though the epoxy says that it's 5 minutes, I like to let it dry for about 24 hours before I heavily start swinging it around or using it, just for good measure and make sure the piece has a solid bond with the wooden dowel.
In a pose, in a pose, in a...
If memory serves, you need to jump and hit the circle button to run along ropes.
Parkour! Michael! Parkour! Parkour! Extreme! Parkour! Parkour!
Juice? Who's got the juice? Picking up on what I'm throwing down? Pizza!